Hey everybody, Robi here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. So if you're looking for a dry belt, of course you know where to go, ScooterWest.com. We always have them in stock. But today I'm going to do something a little different. I have several videos pretty much for every automatic Vespa on how to change a dry belt, including some other scooters. To be honest with you, they're all nearly the same. You know, sometimes the torques are different, but they all look the same. They're all the same components, or very similar components. So you can check out some of my older videos on how to do the job completely. But today I'm going to talk about broken belts and broken dreams. So here we got a 2022, I think it's a 2021 Vespa GTS. And the customer's done some long distance touring at high speeds. And I'm going to talk about the different scenarios where a belt may last a really long time and scenarios where it doesn't last all that. Not even what the service interval is. So, and I want to pull the belt cover and just show you what you're going to find and what you're going to probably want to need to do in addition to just replacing the broken belt. So I'll get right to it. I'll show you it's broken. Pretty much the way you know it's a broken belt, it does pretty much one of two things. The majority of times, the engine will run, just like this one does. It's a little noisy because it's got a pipe on it. You rev it up, tire's not turning. The other scenarios that you have is sometimes it will jam the old broken belt up in the front pulley and stall the motor out, and you try to crank the motor over, it's like a completely locked up motor. And then the much more scary scenario is where the belt goes in the back of the rear pulley and jams up in the clutch, and you end up with a locked up wheel. I don't see that later scenario too much, but it's something to keep in mind, and it could be a dangerous situation because if you have a locked up rear wheel, no power, you're gonna be skidding to a stop. And I have seen that happen, but the majority of times when you end up with the broken belt, motor revs all at once and you have no power to the tire. So now for the fun part, I'm gonna get it apart and let's see what we can find in here. All right, so most importantly, to avoid a broken belt, you should just service the scooter as per what the manufacturer's suggested service intervals. So you can find that chart in your owner's manual or online. The service manual will certainly have it. The classic Vespa GTS, like the 250 GTS and the 300 GTS, all the way up till about 2019, they had the belt change interval of 9,000 miles, which I think corresponds to 20,000 kilometers, 25,000, something like that. Sorry if I don't get that right in my conversion there, but they lasted pretty much 9,000 miles and they almost always would last that interval. Well, in 2020, they came out with a new higher output motor referred to as the HPE motor. It's mostly noted by, it has this really nice looking plastic belt cover on top of a metal belt cover to keep the engine noise down. And certainly the best features, it's got much more power than the outgoing 2019 prior generation 300 motor. They definitely have really good power for their size. And they also have that pretty difficult to check oil level, but fortunately this customer is taking care of that by putting the oil pan with the sight glass. So oil level is good. The good thing is they don't really use much oil. Starting in 2021, they kind of addressed some of those issues with that new motor. But there's still one more downside of this motor, is it does tend to have an appetite for belt. If you drive this scooter easily, just in city traffic, the belt will certainly last a 6,000 mile interval. So they shortened it to 6,000 miles. So technically, they're kind of like a little Porsche. You got to do more maintenance than the old GTS, which was more like a Toyota Corolla. Got this little filter. This can also cause belt breakage, and you're kind of asking why. I can tell that the transmission's gotten hot because the reason being is the filter's slightly melted to the belt cover. But when the filter's clogged and has debris, this is kind of a lot of debris for less than 6,000 miles. That inhibits airflow to the transmission, and you need that airflow to cool the dry belt, and there's the fan that's on the pulley. So it may be just a good idea to replace this. You certainly can clean it. You don't want to oil it. But that's something to keep in mind if the belt temperature is high. Like if you're using the scooter at nearly top speed in 110-degree temperatures, like whatever that is in Celsius, like 60 degrees, really hot temperatures, the belt will fail prematurely. That's just kind of a known. So for instance, say maybe you're doing the scooter cannonball, whatever it is, cross country, like 2,500, 3,000 miles, start with a brand new belt. Even if your belt's half worn, it's just, you might as well set yourself up for success. You know, pretty important to do that. But in this case, the scooter's used at pretty high speeds and under higher load than what I would say normal operation. It's kind of more of the extreme operation. And that's why the belt failed prematurely. And the first telltale that a belt is broken, other than the tire doesn't spin, is you have areas where it's ejecting this fluffy stuff. And you think, well, that's not rubber. Is what that is the filaments, you know, usually the Kevlar bands of the belt. Another question I get a lot is, well, isn't a Malossi or an aftermarket belt better? Well, in my long-term experience, I'm sure in some situations the aftermarket belt might be better, but typically the OEM belt ends up being the longest lasting belt. Even when you hop up the scooter, like this scooter's got a muffler, it's not gonna make a ton more horsepower, but you do little hop-ups, I always find that the OEM belts just seem to hold up the longest. So just food for thought, you know. Normally you'd use the tool that has the 2 pins, but I'm gonna kind of cheat and use the impact. There's all that debris in there anyway, so 19mm, zip this thing off here. You just hold the rear. Nice electric impact does the job with ease. Now I'll get the washer off a little bit later. You got the clamps for your brake hose and such. It's pretty similar with, you know, other models and makes. But we'll get all the belt cover screws. One thing to keep in mind, if you're doing this job like on some of the other brands of scooters, I've never really seen it on the Vespas, but you know, for instance, like a Honda Elite, or I think a Riva or something, a couple of them in the Yamaha Zuma, if you take the belt cover off, all your oil is going to be drained out, because sometimes they actually have the sight glass built into the oil pan, or they have some sort of gasket in there where, you know, you end up with oil that's going to leak out. So, you know, it's always good to have some type of service manual or a YouTube guide on your specific model to see some of the tips and tricks on removing the belt cover. And even I'm kind of a little sloppy at this. Normally I'd take the skirt off, maybe loosen the air box, because you have the screw right here that's really close to the air box. Every situation's a little different depending on the scooter. I find the Vespas are pretty easy to access the belt cover. Some can be harder, some can be very, very expensive. For instance, like a BMW C-Series scooters, an OEM belt's like 500 bucks for one of those scooters. All right, and of course the last fastener is the tightest one. That's the most difficult to get. You know, that's rule number one, always save the most difficult fastener for last. And you know, could take the whole sides off, but I'm gonna improvise. I just want to get the belt cover. I just want to see the carnage here. All right, here we go. There's a ground strap, so it's, you know, make sure all those are put back in place. I have seen issues with scooters where the ground wasn't reconnected. So give it another look. Missed one more fastener. And I think we're good. So yes, indeed, we do have a broken belt. So the first thing you want to check sometimes is when the belt, you know, if there's bearings in here, sometimes the belt filaments will get into the bearings and ruin them. So kind of want to check every exposed bearing, the sealed bearing. This bearing still feels really good. So that's a pretty important check. You just got to check everything a little more thoroughly when you got the broken belt situation here. pull the clutch bell off. There's a little bit extra clutch debris in there. You can see it all in there. So gotta go a little further. We'll have to take this apart and I'll show you that and some of the stuff that we'll want to service on this pulley, because you can see all the filaments are stuck in between. You got more debris. Sometimes the main seals, they'll get filaments like this, the Kevlar filaments in there, and you'll end up developing a leak. And I don't really see any filaments. It looks pretty clean. I wiped a little bit off there. Again, this has got a bearing. I have seen these idler pulleys become damaged from when you have a broken belt. It physically broken, or it may damage that bearing that's in there. Pretty inexpensive part. The only convenient thing is with no belt in the way, everything comes apart nice and easy. And we'll go ahead and take the center pulley off. Typically you use like the holding tool. You want to use the correct holding tool because you do need to torque this, but to get it off, you can improvise with an impact here. A bit of Loctite on there. Take the washers. So you see all the rubber all burned on there. Oftentimes if you have pulleys that are pretty worn, like there's grooves in them, or if you put a straight edge across it and you can see light through it, it's probably time to replace your pulleys, because when they have an uneven surface, they're not gonna work very well with the belt. You know, for instance, I've seen customers put a brand new belt in with all these old worn out pulleys, and then the belt just doesn't last because these worn out pulleys are putting extra strain on that belt. And here's the little biscuit that you get sometimes when you have a broken belt. There's a little tribal ornament. I could make a necklace out of that. So maybe, that's like the memento, with old vintage Vespas, you'd save the old shifting crosses. That's what makes the shifting. But when you have a failure on a Vespa, maybe you get a memento like this. So next, we'll pull the pulley out. That pin still looks good. Carefully pull the variator, movable half pulley here, and I like to tip it so the rollers don't fall out. And rollers, believe it or not, they look pretty good. They can all be cleaned. There's obviously a lot of debris that we need to clean out of here, along with cleaning up that pulley. Let's slide this off. It's pretty important that the splines are in really good shape on the crankshaft. Just earlier this week in the service department, we had a GT200, which were kind of notorious for having the pulley come loose on the crankshaft, but it was ridden so long that it completely damaged the splines on the crankshaft. And if you don't have these splines to engage with these pulleys, you can't really rely on the power being transferred just by the clamping force of the nut that holds it all together. The customer did not opt to replace the crankshaft on that GT200, so all we did is put it back together with new parts and torqued it as tight as we felt comfortable to tighten that bolt, and told them, yeah, eventually it's going to have a problem to come back. But again, there's more filaments. You probably want to take some compressed air, blow all that out. That still feels good, so we're okay there. Another thing you want to check, in addition to the pulleys that are easy access, is we need to take apart the driven pulley. It's very, very important to take this apart. I have a prior video, I think it's how to rebuild the clutch or driven pulley on a Vespa. And we do sell a special tool that holds this. You can always cheat. You can see there's already like a little mark right there, how it was torqued. But we're gonna take it apart. One of the biggest issues is we got to get all the filaments out of here, and we got to clean these pulley housing, and I want to inspect the spring. All right, so I'm going to do the quick and dirty method to take apart a clutch. And of course the more dangerous method, and that's what I always like, but there's a factory tool to take these apart and hold them so they don't explode on you. It's kind of like the equivalent of taking a strut apart on a car. Not quite as violent, but probably want to have some type of safety gear, and that safety gear on my
situation, use these tennis shoes. They'll do everything to protect my life. So I have a big 46mm socket with a couple reducers, and we'll see if this impact has enough to zip it apart. Yep, no problem. And see how it has some tension? It's not a ton of tension, but if you're not prepared for it, that thing will go flying. So we'll start out with a clutch, and I'll show you all the pieces up here. So go ahead and check the shoes for wear, just like I've talked about in other belt job videos. But again, you're gonna want to use some brake parts cleaner and compressed air, along with sanding and deglazing these shoes. So definitely reusable, just needs a little bit of cleaning. And this is when we need to start inspecting parts. So even this part, it's got a lot of debris on it. We'll clean that part. The contra spring also leads to broken belts. So the brand new measurement of this, I think, is 123mm long. But if it measures under 118, it's out of specification. It's pretty inexpensive. Sometimes just replace it if your scooter has high miles anyways. So I think we're okay on this. You know, measuring a couple spots, the spring's kind of hard. We're about 128mm. They say the spec's 118 is the minimum spec, but if you had a brand new one, you put it beside it. Even a brand new one might be just ever so slightly taller than the used one, because what happens over time is heat gets to these and it starts relaxing the spring. And this is the spring that actually puts the tension on the drive belt. And then the next part we're going to need to rebuild is the actual driven pulley. So there's a lot of debris on here. You don't want to put a new belt in there when you have all those filaments. But the nice thing when you have the spring out of the way. So it's pretty important to take this apart. Sometimes they're a little bit stuck, but without the spring, you're going to go ahead and open it up, and we'll be able to pull some of the filaments out. You know, if you're doing like this on the side of the road, obviously, I probably would just try to clean it up the best you can. But if you're in your workshop or your garage, we want to take this all the way apart, because those pulley faces, I think the metal's still good, but there's a lot of rubber on there that we need to get rid of. And oftentimes these oil seals are compromised because they have some of the filaments in the oil seal. So you end up with grease leaking from the variator. And sometimes even this part being worn is also what causes broken belts. So there's an O-ring in here. Usually you want to replace all those parts. There's still some grease in there, but if these guide slots or the pins are worn out, this ramp plate sometimes will get jammed up and stuck in its operation, its normal smooth operation, or if the grease is all dried out, and that will immediately cause a blown belt, especially at high speeds. You know, if you're going full speed on the scooters, putting over 20 horse through this, a rubber belt, think of that, 20 horsepower is going through this belt pretty much, or it might even be a little bit more than that. And if this pulley isn't working correctly, it will allow that belt to slip, and that's just a tremendous amount of temperature buildup in a very short amount of time, and that's what will ultimately lead to a belt failure. So always pretty important to completely overhaul this driven pulley. You pull all the pins out, tear it down, we'll check the bearings, and of course I have all the steps on how to do that on a prior video. So that's pretty much what you're looking at when you're getting in for a broken belt. You may obviously know you need to you obviously know you need to buy a new drive belt, but oftentimes there's other parts. You may want to buy one of our deluxe belt kits from the Scooter West web store, because they include all these O-rings, the seals. We used to have questions all the time, what are these extra parts? And we had customers had no idea that driven pulley comes apart. If you don't want to tackle rebuilding the driven pulley, you can buy it as a complete whole assembly. It's not horribly expensive. It is a fairly pricey part because it's got machined metal parts in it. But for instance, if this scooter had like 40,000 miles, 50,000 miles on it, and it broke a belt, I'd probably replace this pulley, and same with the variator and the front pulley, because starting with a nice fresh transmission components sometimes is what will help you lead to having the full length
a full life of the belt. So you got your little bird's nest. I hope you learned something from my video. Yeah, I know it wasn't the normal how-to video. I have plenty of those on the Vespa Motorsport YouTube channel. We'll see you on the next one. Robot here at scooterwest.com and Vespa Motorsport here in San Diego, California. Guess what? I'm leaving this mess for my techs. They'll do the job later.